Okay, thank you for starting the recording. So I'd like to maybe call on a couple of people in the audience, and maybe you could tell us your name and where you're coming from and why you chose to come tonight. If you really don't want me to call on you, please turn off your video for the moment, and because I'm going to take your video being on as you're willing to do this with me. Let me start with Charles Anthony Messiah. Maybe there's more to that name. Messiah.
Messiah sounds like a good name. And
Yeah.
yeah, Charles Maciati, current MFA candidate at the University of St. Thomas, and it's a privilege to be here. And I'm a student of Joshua Renz, and yeah, really looking forward to the conversation tonight.
Terrific.
Great to see
I
you,
picked you
Charles.
for your impressive library books behind you.
Yeah.
How about Jacob Aki? Do you want to say hello?
Hi, I'm Jacob. I'm an associate editor at First Things Magazine, streaming in from New York.
Well, terrific. And what do you write about?
My
Or you
most
just
recent piece was about Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. It came out today.
So
All right, we'll have to go look for that.
that'll be the soundtrack to the closing credits this evening.
All right, guys, most people are just like, Maggie, what do you mean? I don't want to talk to you. But let's try Terry Curtis. Terry, can you unmute yourself and say hello?
Oh, hi, Lucas.
Hi, Terry. How you going?
Oh my gosh, it's so good to see you. I have watched Lucas grow up, and I just adore him, and I think he's brilliant, and I'm so excited to be invited to this interview, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Lucas. And he's been incredible, even as a small child. I've never seen a kid like him.
Thank you so much, Terry, for coming and giving us that very human point of view. So let's go one more, keeping the sexes. Christina Baker, do you want to say hello, Christina?
Hi, sure. I'm coming in from Lafayette, Louisiana. I'm a CLA member, poet. I've seen Glenn Arbery and Joshua Horan speak before, so that was kind of the draw for me. I'm sorry, Lucas, I'm not familiar with you. I look forward to hearing from you, though. Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, terrific. Thank you all for being here, and we'll have an opportunity to comment and ask questions when we're done for this program. I'd like to start. We have Glenn Arbery, who in a few minutes will be reading from Gates of Heaven, which is the second in your trilogy. It's your second novel.
Third novel.
Your third novel.
Yeah.
When did you write your first novel, Glenn?
It was published in 2015. Second one in 2020.
Now, so that's relatively late in life to write did you write a bunch of novels you never tried to publish? Like
No, I was
Bronte's
mostly writing poetry and raising kids, until my 50s.
And what gave you the courage to say, okay, I've done a lot of interesting things, which we'll get to. What am I doing being a novelist? What was the way you thought about
it? The story sort of pressed its way into being, out of my Southern background. I don't know. I mean, I've always written, and so this was a new venture, and I was delighted that Joshua kind of took me up on it and published it through Wise Blood back in 2015. First one, Bearings.
What's the name of that novel?
Bearings and Distances.
So for those of you who don't know, Glenn Arbery was perhaps best known for running the great Wyoming College. And I think that gives you kind of an interesting perspective on COVID unfolding. What your students are an unusual bunch, but still, what did you start to see happening?
Well, we were uniquely unqualified to go into COVID. Our students are not permitted to have mobile phones, for example, anywhere on campus, not just in the classroom.
That's great.
So that's been a great boon for the college all along. I had never heard of Zoom meetings like this one until the week before we had to send everybody home back in 2020. So we had a lot of catching up to do, but that was quite a process, looking at what was going on in the country very rapidly. This was the second week of March in 2020. And I remember on Wednesday of that week, we were all just kind of milling around thinking about what might be happening. And then the NBA canceled its whole season, which was just a shock. I don't know if y'all remember that. That was a kind of index of the seriousness with which people were taking this. And then in the course of a day or two, we had to go from, telling the students what was going on generally to actually canceling classes and sending everybody home. I mean, the airlines were closing, everything was just shutting down. So, yeah, that was it was an interesting perspective from which to, enter into the whole COVID year.
Well, thank you, Glenn. Joshua, you were running an MFA program, perhaps not as big an impact on running a publishing company, Wise Blood Books. But what did you first notice, and what really stands out to you
Yeah,
as
so
a
I mean,
symbol?
I actually was flying back from a lecture and fiction reading circuit in Texas in late February of 2020. And I remember wearing a mask on the plane for the first time. And that was sort of the commencement of everything. And then during that lecture circuit, I actually proposed the founding of the first Catholic Master of Fine Arts program.
Oh,
And
I see.
I was certain that then once COVID sort of unfolded, that would be a moot point, that it would go from sort of an enthusiastic response to sort of dead on arrival. And instead, I think the opposite happened, precisely because for better and worse, maybe mostly worse, we all moved online for so long that it just became sort of part of the ubiquitous screen culture. But I remember distinctly two things. One was, at that time, I was just leaving my teaching post at Belmont Abbey, and I remember being so grateful because it was warm enough that I could teach outside into December. So the last day of classes, everyone showed up in blankets, and they were, shivering, but we were still able to persist in our discussion of Aquinas and Augustine. And then I also just remember kind of being parked in the car for a long time, and then eventually getting outside of the Adoration Chapel on Belmont Abbey's campus, which was extraordinarily beautiful, and not really being able to go in, but because the walls are made of glass, just kneeling down outside of the chapel itself and sort of longing to be able to break through those doors. Yeah.
That's a powerful image.
Wow.
Lucas Smith, your new short story collection is available with a coupon code. You didn't ask me to do this. It's Joshua who really wants to make sure everyone has a chance to see your work. So it's in the chat room. Spare us yet for COVID 25, $7 with a coupon code. Can't beat that. Lucas,
Yeah.
what do you remember? When did you realize that this was a 100-year event?
Well, yeah, I guess probably in the middle of 2020. Probably took a bit of time to really get to really understand the severity, the impact of it all. But yeah, I was living in Melbourne at the time, and I was unmarried and didn't have any real responsibilities. I was teaching at a couple of universities just casually in Melbourne. And if for those who don't know, Melbourne is sort of, where I was living in particular, sort of a bit like Portland or San Francisco or places like that, Brooklyn, certain those types of inner urban neighborhoods. But I was living in a rectory with a priest, and we were sort of, I guess, a kind of island in the sea of that sort of urban landscape. And so when COVID hit, that's where I was. And so in a way, I was quite lucky because I didn't really experience the type of isolation that many people experience, because we had visitors coming constantly, because it was the church was considered to be a charitable thing that could keep going. Obviously, the church itself had to be closed, but there were a lot of people coming for meals and food, and there was a kind of there were other men in the house as well. So I didn't experience
That's
that sort of.
interesting. Wait a minute. Of course, you're in Australia, so the rules
Yeah.
unfolded differently. But
Yes, and
what you're telling me is the church could be open as a soup kitchen, but could
Yes.
not have anyone in to worship. It was completely closed for worship.
The priest and members of the household. This was sort of a gray area because it was all part of the same address. It was considered the same piece of land. So legally, yes, we who lived in the house probably could go into the church, but in practice, that didn't really happen much. But yeah, it was allowed to remain open as as you say, a soup kitchen for homeless and sort of semi-homeless there's a lot of those around. And yeah, but the other thing about Melbourne was that it was the most locked down city in the world. I think we had a total of 260 days of lockdown across those 2 years, 2020 and 2021. We also had 8 p.m. curfews where you couldn't go anywhere after 8 p.m. unless it was an emergency. We also had a 5-kilometer restriction radius where you were not allowed to go 5 kilometers beyond your house for any reason. And also there was a restriction of 1 hour outside per day per person. So look, and in practice, of course, those rules can't really be enforced. There was no way it was ever going to be enforced. But yeah, it was very, very restrictive. I think more so than almost anywhere else in the world, as far as I'm aware.
That may be China. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah,
but-
possibly some of the early days in China. Yeah.
But anyway, thank you, Lucas. What inspired you to, I mean, let me put it this way. Your short story collection is about many things. To what extent do you think COVID is a significant inspiration for this story collection? And to what extent is it kind of a partial glimpse?
Well, it's extremely significant because it actually amounts to only about 25% of the book, a story set in the COVID period. But it's extremely significant because it feels like a very formative experience for me. It's something that I'm actually pleased that I went through in the time and place that I did. And it really revealed a lot about human nature and the nature of politics and big cities and media and all kinds of things that I don't think I would have gotten any other way, that I had sort of read about in some ways. And when you read about some of the East Bloc countries, under communism, you get a sort of, I think COVID, I wouldn't want to equate COVID in Melbourne with any of that, but it was a little bit of a taste. It was just a tiny little kind of, just a tasting menu of that.
Okay, you just said something unusual, Lucas. You said
Yeah.
you were very glad that you went through it.
Yeah, ultimately, yes.
Formative.
Yeah, definitely. It was definitely formative. It will completely inform the rest of my life, how I live, what I teach my children. Everything will be changed because of that experience. Yeah, for sure.
And as an artist?
Yep, I think definitely. And it gave me a lot of inspiration because there's so much pressure. There was so much pressure on people from so many directions, and the difficulties of people following their consciences and caring for others and being true to their core beliefs. And also, I think that people's core beliefs were revealed to be something other than perhaps what they would have hoped that they were. We have this concept of revealed preferences where you can tell what people believe by what they do rather than what they say, this kind of idea. So yeah, it was extremely powerful. And also the nature of politics in so-called liberal democracies, that really was a major something major that was revealed to me, that politics does not work in the way that we are taught that it works. It's much dirtier and well, that the ideas about human rights and liberal values and things like that are very much contingent on things being normal, and that can change whenever they, or they, I shouldn't say they, but whenever they want, it can change. It's not really something that is taken very seriously at the highest levels, I think.
Yeah, depending on where you are, and certainly they're
Yeah,
contested.
sure.
It's very obvious in San Francisco when they allowed 12 people in churches, mostly for the purpose of holding and televising, broadcasting, live
Yeah.
streaming the services, which the Protestants in San Francisco seemed mostly okay with, because they're the word, they're about the word, which you can do on Zoom. But uniquely disadvantaged the faith traditions like the Catholic or the Orthodox, that for whom the center of worship is the Eucharist, and you can't live stream the Eucharist. And so when they said they were opening up churches, they stuck a provision. I don't think the mayor knew about it. I think it was some guy trying to get Archbishop Cordileone stick it to the Catholic Church. But they said that only one person at a time would be allowed in a church for private prayer, no matter how large. Now, the Cathedral of San Francisco seats around 4,000 people.
Yeah.
But it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because it made it extremely clear. The Archbishop went on a campaign to free the Mass very publicly. He asked us to help draw attention, because city officials were just ignoring it and treating the Catholic Church very disrespectfully. I think he doesn't say that, but I do. And so this was at a time when they opened up art museums, tattoo parlors, marijuana parlors, liquor stores.
Yeah.
But only one person could go into a church. And in the United States, the First Amendment is generally interpreted to mean that you cannot treat religion any worse than any other category. And they were pretty quickly slapped down, but it took another few months to really open up the Mass here. So that was quite an interesting experience. But let's switch and enjoy, or at least get a chance to appreciate, some actual works of art by our artist. And I think I'd like to start with Glenn Arbery, who will be reading from his forthcoming novel, The Gates of Heaven.
Thank you, Maggie. This is a big and complicated novel. So I'm taking two pieces here that have to do very explicitly with COVID. I have to say this whole novel is framed by COVID. It takes place during the fall of 2020 and ends on January 6, 2021. Its major thematic concentration on General Sherman comes from the fact that the student who would be going to high school can't, because COVID has closed the school. So he's taking on this project as a kind of homeschooling thing. In any case, this is about his father, Carl Guisac. It's election day in 2020. Guisac runs a Wyoming news site, and he already knows that the state is going to go overwhelmingly for Trump. So he wants to go out to the reservation and get a different take, because it typically votes Democratic. He's been getting sicker and sicker all morning as he goes out there, and just as steadily denying it, because he's been a COVID skeptic all along. So this scene is from his stop for breakfast at the general store on the reservation. Could I have one of those sausage and egg sandwiches? Yes, sir. This one? She pointed to one being kept warm inside the glass, and Guizak nodded. She wrapped it and set it next to the coffee and rang him up. And a box of donuts? They ain't nothing but powdered. They ain't fresh. It's all right. He handed her his credit card, and he added, listen, he felt a cough about to start and fought it down. Listen, I have a website called Sage Grouse. You write that? I read it, she said. You do the Socrates Johnson thing. That's right. You must be Mr. Guzak. Guizak, he said. Mr. Guizak, I'm Amy White Plume. Pleased to meet you. She exposed her face for a second, a big warm smile, and held out her hand, and he shook it. A chill went through him. Your hand's kind of hot, she said warily. She reached under the counter and brought out a big plastic bottle of sanitizer and squirted her hands, offering it to him. He shook his head. I hope you ain't getting the COVID. We've had lots of folks die out here. Seriously? You don't think dying is serious? No, sorry, Guizak said. I hope I'm not getting it. I can't get it because, well, listen, I'm looking for the polling place here in town to do a few. The cough overcame him, and he looked at her as though he had fallen overboard and she were leaning over the side of the boat watching him sink. He bent double before he could stand back up. She stared at him. A few interviews, he said at last, if you could point me in the right direction. I'm telling you, you sound like them people who died. You better not be doing interviews this morning. But she pointed out the window. So people vote over at the school on Ethody Road. You see the turn right over there? You see that? I see it. It's about a mile. She handed him the bag, and her dark eyes took him in seriously. It's election day, he said. I'm a journalist. Hold on. She reached under the counter again and came up with a forehead thermometer that she beeped at him. You're almost 103, she exclaimed. Before he could move his hand from the counter, she clamped an oximeter on his middle finger. Stay put a minute. Come on, Amy, you ain't a damn nurse, said the next man in line. She ignored him. And this says 87. Sweet Lord, Mr. Guizak, you need to get tested and get some medicine. It ain't safe for you to be running around. I don't feel that bad. No way, no way, no way he could get COVID. Not on election day. He'd worked through it. His head pounded. Another chill shook him. You see that? Said the cashier, showing him a second reading. 103.8. You got somebody I could call? How about Mrs. Guizak? You shouldn't be talking to nobody. You could be spreading it. You hear what I'm saying? I hear you. You stay away from those people at the school. Yes, ma'am. So Guizak tries to make it to the school, but he passes out on his way there and drives off the road, breaks his arm, gets hospitalized with the worst case of COVID that the local hospital has ever seen. So he's life flighted to Salt Lake City. This is fairly typical out here in Wyoming. This next section comes considerably later in the novel when Guizak wakes from an induced coma. Before he went into the reservation on election day, he had just read what his son had been writing about General William Tecumseh Sherman for his senior project. And in the dream world of his coma, Guizak and Sherman have merged. Mr. Guizak? The sound was coming from somewhere far above him, perhaps from between the two clouds drifting high over the Georgia landscape north of Atlanta. He felt a sharp prodding in his shoulder. Here it was, the sharpshooter's bullet he had expected every day. Now his shirt would blossom with blood, and then he would fall sideways from his horse, thinking of a face appeared in the heavens, the nose and mouth covered by a white, oddly beaked mask. Two eyes peered down at him from behind a pair of owlish black-rimmed glasses. Mr. Guizak? It was the voice of a woman who had torn open the blue skies of 1864 like a tissuey curtain and conjured a room with fluorescent lights alternating with white ceiling tiles. Other heads, other masks appeared in a circle around him, looking down. Were these the gods? Surely not. Mr. Guizak, we're bringing you out. Can you hear me? He heard an odd, rusty squawk from the area of his throat. I can't hear you. Mr. Guizak, do you know where you are? It did not seem right to ask. No, this must be the next phase of his examination. He had no idea where he was, actually, so he shook his head. He wanted to make a self-deprecating gesture, but found he could not lift his hands. And as he realized that he was bound, he panicked, trying to shake free. They lifted something that had covered his nose and mouth, and he could see tubes coming into it. It was hard to breathe. Where was he? Hands were pressing against him. Mr. Guizak, Mr. Guizak. He closed his eyes. A thought came to him, like the first dove returning to Noah's Ark, the one with nothing in its mouth. He saw himself leaving the store on the reservation, driving toward Ethity to check on the vote. Mr. Guizak. He opened his eyes for a second and then closed them again. Now the second dove came back, and he took from the dove's beak a small strip of paper like the one in a fortune cookie, and he opened it. It was a note from Teresa. Where are you? Mr. Guizak. He opened his eyes and focused on the owl woman. Do you know where you are? No, he answered sensibly. You are still in the intensive care unit of the hospital at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. Your wife has been keeping in close touch the whole time you have been here under sedation. You have COVID pneumonia. The air sacs keep filling with fluid leaking from the capillaries and the lung tissue, and it's difficult to get enough oxygen into you. We're going to have to induce a coma again to keep you on the ventilator, but now might be a good time to talk to your wife. How long? Here. About 10 days. He tried to speak, but gave up. You were life flighted to Salt Lake City. When was it? She asked one of the others. Election day, the first Tuesday in November, correct? What was the date? November 3rd. Today is Thursday, November 12th. Sir, please don't exert yourself. Is my wife here? Breathing was very painful. More than anything, he wanted to see Teresa and Jacob. He wondered if Rose had flown home. No, sir, visitors are not allowed into ICU for any reason. But if you'd like to talk to her on the telephone, is she here? No, sir. She's not in Salt Lake City. No, sir. We have your phone, someone said. He shook his head. You should call. I don't want to alarm you, but sometimes, it's difficult to say how long you might be under again this next time. So you might, the hell with it. Put me under. Mr. Guizak, you can't blame your wife for the policies we're required to follow. He shook his head again and felt the restless and uncertain stirring of the doctors and nurses above him. Mr. Guizak, just effing put me under. That's it.
Wow. Lucas, do you have any comments or reaction?
No, it's great. Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a very powerful idea. I love the idea of going back in to General Sherman, and it makes me think about where would I end up in historical time if I was put into it. Well, I'm trying to think. I guess it's very telling about someone's character where they end up. But it's great. Yeah, I love all
Josh?
the details. Yeah.
Josh, do you have
Oh,
any
yeah. Yeah,
reaction?
I also think it puts me in the mind a little bit of Thomas Mann's novel, The Magic Mountain, in that Hans Castorp travels to this mountaintop sort of spa in Davos to visit his cousin who's sick with something like tuberculosis. And then he himself ends up staying there for 7 years, because it turns out that there's something wrong with him as well. And the doctor basically says, you know, this is revealing itself to you now that you have this sickness, but this sickness has been inside of you for much longer than you realized. And it's a way of sort of getting at the connection between sort of the medical and the metaphysical, in the sense that, right, in Glenn's novel as well, when Guizak goes through this ordeal of COVID, it turns not just into a kind of an attempt to keep him alive in a medically induced coma, but also into a kind of final judgment or last judgment kind of examination of conscience. And more than an examination of conscience, kind of there are voices that come and visit him and interrogate him and put to question really not only his life, but all of much of American history that's tied up with the South. So yeah, it's incredible. Yeah.
I was listening, I began to think about, do we have like, what is the literature of the plague that is available to us? I mean, there's a book called The Plague by Albert Camus, and somehow Children of Men seems to me to somehow, most of what I am familiar with is actually sort of apocalyptic quasi science fiction blending into zombie literature. Is there a, and what am I missing? I mean, and I can think of a few Victorian examples. There's a novella by Margaret Oliphant about it's not really a plague, but he's dying of tuberculosis and their time in the sanatorium. So I don't know, does Glenn, did you have any models that inspired you?
Well, you know, when COVID first happened, I was writing a weekly column as president of the college here. And when I think the first week or two, I had just been teaching the Greeks in our humanities sequence. And it starts to be amazing when you think about it, how much plague comes up in the literature of the Greek world. Oedipus, the king, begins with a plague that, you know, that Apollo or somebody has sent. They're not sure. That's why they've sent Creon to Delphi to try to find out. The Iliad begins with a plague. The old prophet of Apollo has been insulted by Agamemnon. He prays to Apollo, and Apollo sends a plague down that's killing, you know, hundreds of men and animals at the same time until there's an intervention and they find out what the issue is. Interestingly, in the ancient world, plague is taken to be divinely sent. You know, it's not a medical phenomenon. It's something that opens you onto the mystery of the divine and the mystery of human guilt. You know, you think particularly about Oedipus and, you know, the plague that he brings on the city in which nothing can be born, you know, nothing can come to fruit in the vegetable world. Animals can't bear their young. Women die in childbirth. You know, it's nothing can come out. So I think it's been a major kind of image, or well, it's not even the right word, a kind of, you know, backdrop for the literary imagination, you know, from ancient times.
Yeah, I would also just bring up Dickens' novel Little Dorrit, which begins with Arthur Clement kind of returning from China, and he's sort of docked in France at Marseille because everyone who's returning from China is suspected of bringing the cholera with them, and so they're all put in quarantine. And one of the characters, Mr. Meagles, said something that kind of is a riff off of what Lucas said, but I think coming from a very different spirit. So Mr. Meagles, when they finally let them out of quarantine, says, you know, I think I'm ready to forgive my prison, right? I actually look back fondly on the days that they had put me in quarantine. And then there's another character, Miss Wade, who's sort of is not buying it at all. She says there's some things that sort of should not be forgiven. I'm paraphrasing. And I think for Mr. Meagles, you know, this desire to sort of establish a very sentimental, emotional shortcut kind of reconciliation with quarantine comes from his larger inability to reckon with reality. Later on, he ends up committing suicide after his playing with the stock exchange gets messy. Whereas I think with Lucas, what he's saying is it's not so much that it made him grateful in this kind of sentimental sense, but rather because it incited a kind of an opportunity. It was an occasion to really come to terms with hidden things that had been apocalyptically unveiled in a way that would not have been through any other means. So,
Well, the chat is
Yep.
quite lively here, so maybe I can read it. People can respond or not. Chris Josephson says, it reminded me of Town of Cats by Haruki Murakami. I've never read that. Does that strike a bell with anyone? Karen says that having lived through COVID as a reality, it's just fascinating to hear it as fiction, which in maybe not the most articulate way speaks to this double role that art has. I mean, it is fascinating, but what we lived through it. Why do we need to see it in art too? What is that about? Does anyone have a thought on that?
Joshua, I think probably you.
Yeah, I
Best
mean,
to-
I think that, I just wrote a response to a Wall Street Journal essay on this question of why there haven't been any great novels that have come out of kind of COVID tide, and that including not only the pandemic, but also, sort of Black Lives Matter movement and all of the other attendant January 6th and all the other attendant sort of crises that really threatened to push our nation to a breaking point. And I think, Lucas had mentioned this online not long ago, that in part the answer is we just haven't had enough time. I mean, Flaubert dealt with the 1848 revolution in France, but he was writing Sentimental Education in 1868, 1869 it was published. So that's 20 years. Tolstoy, when he's starting War and Peace, begins with tackling the Decembrist Revolution, and then he realizes he needs to go further and further back in time. So suddenly he's back to 1805, and he's
Yeah.
writing in the middle of the late middle of the 19th century. So I think that's part of it. I also think that there is, frankly, just a certain amount of self-censorship that's mandated and cultivated in the face of sort of the pieties of the literary establishment. Although I'm always a little bit wary of kind of going in that direction too far, because I think sometimes that's just a sign of kind of resentment that people don't have the platform that they want. But having read Glenn and Lucas's work and published it, I know that it's not just sort of like touting sort of mediocre talent. I also think that, in terms of why we need to reckon with it, I mean, this is going all the way back to Aristotle. He says that it's this strange phenomenon in the Poetics. Aristotle says it's a strange phenomenon that there are things that we would not crane our necks to stare at if we saw them in real life. We would turn away in horror if we witnessed them in real life. But if we see them represented realistically, compellingly, movingly, kind of in art, we experience kind of awe and gratitude. And I think it's partially because art achieves what Dietrich von Hildebrand calls transposition, right? It puts it in a different register. And I don't mean to say that journalism doesn't have its place. It obviously does. I hate these sorts of binary things where it's like either you're in politics or you're into art, you're into journalism or you're into high culture. Forget all of that. I think that both of them have their place. But whereas journalism is really caught up with, especially now, kind of this 24-hour cycle, art gives us the ability to transpose things or have them transposed for us in a way that gives us kind of the 10,000 feet view, or the view that makes it feel like you're really experiencing not just sort of things on a horizontal level, but sort of vertically as well, like into the depths of the depths. And to have just that detachment and distance that allows you to contemplate these things in a way that is more honest and frank than maybe you contemplated it when you went through it, I think is a way for us to kind of collectively suffer together and shoulder the burden of that suffering together, just like the Greeks did when they went to the theater, right? They shouldered the burden of Oedipus and his whole city together.
All right,
Because
Josh,
they wouldn't have been able to do it any other way.
You're being too interesting, and I want to make sure there's time for the reading. But I also want to just go through quickly some of the other comments from Mike showing his writing chops. The dialogue was like a taut rope over an abyss. the nurse's care, hiding the terrible fact that her patient is going there and doesn't want fakery on the way down. Bravo. Fritz says some great Italian works in the play we used during COVID: Boccaccio's Decameron, Manzoni's Promessi, The Betrothed, and even Primo Levi's La Tregua, The Truce, for the end of severe COVID. Inga says Romeo and Juliet, one of the factors contributing to the tragedy is that Friar John is quarantined. Fritz also used Dante during COVID. You can always use Dante, though. Katie's, as for the contemporary plague fiction handling of the 20s influenza pandemic, They Come Like Swallows by William Maxwell, Pale Horse, Pale Rider by Catherine Ann Porter. Do note the time window between the experience and the publication. We are just beginning to see the first fruits of the necessary reflection this occasioned. COVID, this is from Chris. COVID forced us to face the temporal in a different way, as William Lynch alludes to in Chris and Apollo. So thank you all for joining in this conversation. And I'd like now to go to Joshua Haren. If you could introduce what you're reading from Blue Wall Falling Down.
Sure. Yeah. So this novel is it tracks Stella Tesknota, the protagonist, after her fiance, Blake Yorick, who's the protagonist of my first novel, Infinite Regress, has sort of unexpectedly broken off their engagement and disappears without any explanation. And she throws herself into a tough teaching assignment in South Chicago. And while she's there, she falls into a kind of reckless romance with an activist, sort of former member of Black Lives Matter, who's since kind of distanced himself from some of that, but still is sympathetic with a lot of its ends. His name is Peter Clavier. And so the novel sort of inhabits three main consciousnesses, and one of them is Stella's. One of them is Reagan, Stella's father, who, in the meantime, when she's down in Chicago during COVID season, has done things like traveled to Washington, D.C. on January 6th, and it comes out the other side a very different man than the father who she grew up with. And also Peter Clavier, who travels to Washington, D.C. to kind of try to stave off an act of political violence. So I'm reading three quite short sections that inhabit each of these three different consciousnesses. The first is Stella's. The morning after, several mornings after she and Peter have fallen into bed together, and it's the first day of COVID. So, and they work, at a school in South Chicago that's fictional, but it's called St. Cabrini's. The next morning, Principal Habs was waiting at the entrance with a tissue box that was, it turned out, filled to overflowing with a fabric of gauzy baby blue, coaching and ushering the swarming arrivals into some semblance of a straight line. All who entered were asked, meaning required, meaning forced, to wear matching surgical masks. And so the kids were making fun of death and turning the threat into a game. To tell your story. Biting holes in the middle of the mouth cloth.
Hey, Josh, you've muted yourself.
No, yes, Josh, can you unmute yourself?
Okay,
Sorry.
let me try that. Should I try that again? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
I don't know how that happened, but of course it would. Forgive me. So did you hear the synopsis? Is that come through? Yeah, okay. So the next morning, Principal Habs was waiting at the entrance with a tissue box that was, it turned out, filled to overflowing with a fabric of gauzy baby blue, coaching and ushering the swarming arrivals into some semblance of a straight line. All who entered were asked, meaning required, meaning forced, to wear matching surgical masks, and so the kids were making fun of death and turning the threat into a game. Biting holes into the middle of the mouth cloth, trying to blind their crushes by covering their eyes with blue folds, breaking the elastic because it would not fit. If you didn't have such a big head, they teased, maybe if he wasn't so arrogant, you could stand to put this on for a second and see how you're really not that important. Stella needed to get her breath. She left the room and passed Peter in the long hallway that led to the ladies' room. Both mouths masked like visiting surgeons, eyes starved for a clue or a code, made polite bows and passed on by, pretending never to have met. Now, this is several days later at Stella's apartment, where she's alone. The red cross of the pregnancy test lit her face in the dark bathroom mirror. She needed to get to the store for a light bulb, but the sudden closures and lockdowns kept the nerves lit like a bundle of brittle kindling. Waiting, settling for shade after sunset, she stopped inside until her stomach curved out, faked it into a full natal swell, stood there stuck in strange relief. Maternity leave. The baby almost an afterthought to bedbound days enshrined by clauses in the far back of the faculty handbook of a school that worked you always overtime and perpetually appealed to a sacrificial service that was hard to naysay without sounding sacrilegious. Cut from a single mold, formed from severe iron, the same Jesus expired in every hall, set under the tall peaked arches from nails that looked too thin to hold him, hung asphyxiated from the asbestos walls of every old room in the building. She held the pillow over her throbbing head, pleased by the mild fever that had driven her to order the tests from an untried same-day delivery service that dropped off groceries at your door for no fee. Strange to stand at the threshold window and wave to the masked driver in mute thanks, half for the weird mercy of drop-off, half because he kept his distance and didn't blink. She'd waited until his car peeled away before she dragged the brown bag inside, gloved fingers, winter gloves, carried it like a sack of dog shit up the stairwell with the wobbly wood steps, and in disbelief that she had forgotten to order 2/3 of the needed groceries, dumped the contents onto the table and took the brown bag over to the window, watching it dive to the dumpster below. The radio, a low and crackling fuzz to keep out the street's night noises, said with disinterest and mingled concern, 2 years for tearing down an abolitionist statue in the wake of Strangled, before another station intervened to opine, by every measure a sign of decline, but that's why I tell my clients it's important to laugh. See, at a time like this, what other remedy remains? And then the first station's stretched out voice resumed, clearly the cause of death. Unable to reach the off button, she seized the cord and yanked it out. 3 golden prongs cut short of current, but flashing blue before they went cold. 3 lemons to slice the nausea and an off-brand bottle of acetaminophen to quell the fever that led her to suspect something more than a migraine was the matter. The pregnancy test, a last-minute item, just in case, just in case. And now her baby would be born with a mask, knit blue from spent blood in the womb. Now this next sequence is her father, Reagan, remembering his time on January 6th, 2021. The cops shot tear gas and the mustard tendrils spread, fingering his lungs like an indigestible ghost. The mohawked man, all in black with a jail-striped shirt, stood on the ledge blocking the irritant munitions with a plastic shield he had stolen from the police, and as he raised it, boasting his victory, as an if headless arm reached around the arched window and gripped his mohawk and shook the shield loose, making way for another round of tear gas. Reagan, heels stinging, fell to the steadying muscles of camouflaged men who moved as a unit. As they crawled out of the cracked Capitol windows and lowered onto the claustrophobic crowd, easing sideways down the staircase, flush with shoulder-to-shoulder bodies ascending, the militia formed a chain, escorting him through crazed congestion. That should have kept him stuck for hours, and if he had been, he would have tasted a little hell, hyperventilating as he did, lost in numbers. But their leader assumed they were safe and shouted pale breaths of all clear from a tight ski mask that made him look like an ant. Projectiles spat out their white fog and threatened to blind eyes and wound flesh. They had all fallen like toy soldiers, mostly out of shape and sore. poorly oiled G.I. Joe figures rubbing their faces in the winter grass whose yellow could not hide their configuration from the police guns perched on the railing. The muscles of Reagan's gut were stretched so tight, like secondhand rubber bands about to break. He could barely breathe. He needed a bathroom. At least this position allowed him to unzip his pants discreetly and empty his bladder under cover. Relieved, hungry, he chewed the cud, the weed that triumphed through the frozen lawn. His first meal at the people's house, and not at all bad food. When he looked up, the dull sky was covered by a film that blurred not only his perception, but every conviction he'd come there to claim. Now, this final excerpt is Peter Clavier, who has been recruited to help train some people in Washington, D.C. to participate in an act of political violence against a senator, but who is trying to redirect their violence toward a symbolic statue instead. Peter entered the unmarked room to find a defunct cubicle. Bad light, bad air, and a dozen masked volunteers, some with sunglasses and blue surgical numbers, others with ski masks, still another several strangers who wore outside their already ski masked mouths the sky blue coronavirus cotton. It will be the starting point of everything, said a pink-faced man, skinny, spry, blushing, long forehead like a mule's stubborn nose. No nonsense wizened eyes, adjusting his bun and looking around at all the clacking and packaging happening across the alabaster tables. He coughed into a busted fist, either badly chapped or fresh from a punching bag suspended from a bathroom ceiling. Following Peter's stare, he relaxed his fist and mussed up his hair and said, casually, "Revolution. Simple starts. Lenin and his friends. A dozen to begin with. Now look. Jesus." The words lifted his phlegm-stained mask. Spittle stippled his chin. With his other hand, he sorted white capsules filled with tiny black particles into small blue cylindrical bottles that read in bright red, "Pain Killer." A woman whose hair matched the chrome pipes that wound upward like upside-down tree roots peeled labels and stuck them to the bottles of explosives before she tossed them delicately to the end of the table. The concentration in the upper room was as tight as the boiler in its center. To the adjusting eyes, to the newly arrived, the long room's inhabitants worked without ceasing. The walls were exposed, no drywall even to cover the wires. The pipes, so the place assumed the look of a computer chip's underbelly. All admirably fixated on the tasks assigned by whom? By whom Peter needed to find, for always there was a center of power, especially among those allergic to hierarchies. The pink-faced man screwed up his face and shook a pill bottle and sent the cylinder skidding down the table as if fate were hungry and only he could keep it fed. Peter was moved by the man's devotion, the sun's fire paling through the tinted glass, the last of its light capturing them possessed on the cheeks of the veteran revolutionary. He looked as if he had traveled with Trotsky, or at least transcribed the man's dying thoughts. Had to be at least in his 80s, coughing, his mask ineffectual, slung from an ear, tickling his throat, stimulating a smile. The stranger's eyes went white with heated visions. "In my 20s, I helped derail a train with nuclear waste," he said, "in an unpopular and unpopulated part of Ohio. Demonstrate how easily it is, how easy, how fragile the system. The news went crazy on it, feasted for a week, fattened everybody up on fear, and then went back to sleep. I've lost faith in the tactics of symbols. Now, a shame. Symbols do not work, but death is the only thing that talks now."
Thank you, Joshua. I have a question about your creative process, since you are not only a novelist, but a teacher of writers at the University of St. Thomas in Houston, the co-founder with James Matthew Wilson of the Creative Writing MFA. How do you personally know when you're done, when you've completed a work of art like this?
Well, I was consoled when I was reading recently that the Danish novelist Henrik Pontoppidan had revised his novel A Fortunate Man something like 5 to 7 times after the first printing. And I think of Henry James, also the great American novelist, who had the occasion later in life to kind of rewrite, in a sense, all of his earlier novels, modifying them with his later stylistic sensibilities. And so, in a way, you know, there's no way that you can ever fully finish, and every artist knows the kind of gaping abyss and the chasmic feeling that you have between what you wanted to say and what you tried to say. So I do think that it's essential at a certain point to, you know, go to rely on someone else's outside judgment to say, all right, you know, sort of give it a rest. Like, you've been in the ring long enough and somebody needs to tap you on the shoulder and say, if you keep doing this, it's going to be a knockout. So, you know, and it's not going to look pretty. I think that there's a point beyond which, in that sense, if you work on something too much at the same period in your life, you can actually begin to make it worse. So maybe later on, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, you can look back and say, that's kind of an embarrassing sentence. I wouldn't have written that now. But, you know, it's impossible to have that godlike view because we're mortal and limited. So,
Len, do you have an answer to that for in your work as an artist?
When it's done, no, as I wrote to Joshua several times when I was writing Gates of Heaven, I could edit this forever, you know, and I could start on page 1 and keep changing things, you know, trying to improve it, trying to get it better. But at some point, you just have to let it go. And I'm not, now you make me wonder if that's even when you publish it.
we can talk about a second.
Can I have that back, please? You know, yeah.
Well,
So,
one other line that I think kind of speaks to this, just very short, from John Milbank, and he said, "Beauty is that which wounds us satisfyingly. The desire to see more always arrives."
Hmm.
So when you're contemplating something that is beautiful, even if it's hard and ugly in certain ways, the desire to see more always arrives. It always arrives, but sometimes that's just what needs to happen off the page, not on the page.
Lucas, do you have the same experience? I'm not sure it's universal, actually. Of course, I'm not a fiction writer, but
Yeah.
I tend to have a more clear sense of when I've achieved my mission. I don't know about you, Lucas. What is it?
Yeah, I definitely have the same experience. I think, yeah, you can never be 100% satisfied with what you create as a writer, or at least that almost never happens to me. But you do reach a point where I agree with Joshua, where you can feel that actually working on this more is not going to make it better. And I think you just have to have enough experience to kind of just feel when that is happening. And I've definitely felt that. Yeah.
Oh, right. Well, Lucas, would you care to explain to us what you're going to share?
Yeah. I'm going to read from a story called Render Unto. And I'm going to read about half of the story, not in a linear fashion. I'm going to pick and choose some different sections. And this is probably the most explicitly COVID related story in the book, in the sense that I'm sort of directly addressing events. Other stories do that as well, but this is probably the one that's most explicitly presenting some of the issues that arose in that time. And it's told from the perspective of a priest in first person. So, and the main action is about a parishioner who's refusing to wear a mask. And now that the lockdown has ended and the churches have reopened, but there's still this mask mandates, and he's refusing. And how is this issue dealt with? Yeah, so render unto. And sorry, I'll be reading from, I don't have it up on my screen. I'll be reading from the book, so forgive me for looking down. Nathan.
Can you hold up that book jacket? Hold up that book jacket.
Oh, sure. Yeah,
there you go. Okay.
Spare us yet and other stories. Yeah. $7 today only. Nathan isn't wearing a mask. It's Tuesday morning mass, the first after 4 months of shutdown, and I have just looked up from reading the welcome. There they all are, 15 or so, surely the largest weekday congregation in the diocese, just saying, all with the toothpaste blue or a more tasteful solid black or flower pattern on their faces. Face nappies, as Sky News called them last night. I have to remember to see the dignity behind them. These are the regulars, and it's heartening for me to see them still showing up. All there, except for Madeline, who's in hospice dying. From cancer, not the virus. I must remember her son, Orlando, at the intercessions. He's locked in his room at the care facility and unable to understand why. During the Alleluia, the voices are muffled, except mine and Nathan's. I've started using a French medieval chant in a minor key that seems to fit the times. When he came up for communion, I tried to keep my face neutral and even gave a slight smile. Just 2 more years until retirement. When the churches were closed, I was proud of the fact that I never locked the door. It was always open, slightly ajar, and I knew people had come in because I saw them, or their little artifacts, pen caps, chewing gum wrappers, prayer requests, or the traces one can't avoid, like footprints on wet days. I knew the place so well I could tell at a glance when a pew cushion had been sat on. During the shutdown, I prefer that word to lockdown. We had mass every day, just Nathan and I in the house. Our associate priest, Father Matthew, came once a week, which was all his scruples would allow, as he lived in the flat behind the church, and so technically belonged to a separate household. While the lockdown had just ended, the 8 p.m. curfew was still enforced, as was the 5-kilometer personal restriction radius, and various bewildering and inconsistent number caps were placed on every form of human gathering. It was 50 in a church, 100 in a brothel, 200 in a pub, something like that. What can we do about Orlando? Asked Kath, my parish treasurer, helping herself to coffee in my kitchen as is usual after weekday mass. Nothing right now, we're not allowed to visit. She is silent for a while, then says, surely there's something that can be done. No visits, nothing. On compassionate grounds? I wish. They've just had an outbreak, so they're still on total lockdown. Nathan makes scrambled eggs as usual, and I have toast. Of course, I say nothing to him during breakfast in front of Kath and Father Matthew. I learned it was usually better to address troublesome things after a period of time had passed. I would prefer to wait a few days, but there is mass tomorrow morning, so I will have to address it tonight. As we do every Tuesday, Kath and I discuss the finances. Excuse me. Kath and I discuss the finances, which at present are almost embarrassingly healthy, so we have little to discuss, which is a great blessing. We are so familiar with each other that several conversations can go on over the weeks without the need to explain anything, which is why she can say without preamble, think of Rosemary and Elizabeth, they're almost 90. I'll speak to him tonight. Luke 20:25. Yes, I know. He's my parishioner, he's my friend. I have to do what's best for his soul. Excuse me. Yes, we all love him. If only he knew. When she leaves, I glance at my computer. There's an official complaint from a parishioner who will remain nameless about Nathan and his face, with the Archbishop's office CC'd. Already, sometimes, honestly, these people. I reply that I will be handling the matter and will be in touch if I require any assistance. There was something that I remembered reading in Newman, I think it was, about what the Anglo-Catholic churches did during an epidemic in the 19th century. And I spend the next hour in my study flipping through my books, which helps me forget the world outside and even why I was reading in the first place. Nathan comes in after curfew. The government's, of course, not mine, as if I would ever be so gauche as a landlord. And after I've had a few glasses of wine. What's this about not wearing a mask? It's the law. I know how you feel, but you have to do it, I say. Excuse me. It's not so much that I won't, it's that I can't, he replied. Oh, come on, this is teenage stuff. I'm not saying it's not absurd. The absurdity is the point. They're doing their best. It's a hard time. They're not even trying. It's a fake problem. The mask is a sign of submission to a lie. His voice is growing louder. This isn't a war, I say. This is not the hill to die on. Well, then what is? Believe what you want. Just put it on. No, it's a sign of fear. Christians shouldn't be afraid of death. It's the law. It's an insane law. I'm a priest, a responsible person, a public person. I can't go openly defying. Oh, yes, the precious reputation of the church. I think people would respect the church more if they did break the law. I can't have politics in my church, Nathan. It's not political, it's metaphysical. But everyone else will see it as political. That's not my problem. But it's mine. The Lord says we are to render unto Caesar, meaning obey the earthly authorities, even if we don't wish to. Is this made in the image of Caesar? He points at his face. That's not the point. Then what is? You can't tell me that covering your face during Mass has no meaning, Father. No spiritual meaning, I mean. Well, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I emailed the Archbishop about it when it was announced last week, and I said that given in restaurants you don't have to wear a mask, and that Mass is a communal meal, we shouldn't have to either. And you know what he said? No. He said, or one of his minions said, that there was a requirement to put your mask on between bites. Can you believe that? It's a lie. That is what I expected, and I can't respond. I can't agree that the Archbishop is a liar, and I can't defend that. But then again, Mass is more than a communal meal. Yes, I say, I agree there are inconsistencies in the government's response, but they're doing their best. Nathan rolls his eyes and does that irritating raised eyebrow, closed mouth smile. I do love him, but he can be a right git. I couldn't even hear anyone during the Alleluia except myself this morning. Do you think it's honoring God covering your face like that? Here I draw up and stand with righteousness. Are you saying those people today weren't honoring God? I ask with some force in my voice. Well, no, but you have a certain arrogance sometimes, Nathan. You were the one who taught me to follow the truth. It's a very serious matter and very foolish to deny yourself the sacraments. Well, I'm fasting, just like everyone else was during lockdown. And, he adds, it might be a mistake, but you have to let me do it. Nathan skulks around the house. I have to remind myself often not to resent him, but it's hard. You have to let me. He is right. I and the vast majority of the country could think he is foolish and cutting his nose to spite his face, but he's entitled to do so. You can't force people to church anymore, though ironically, Nathan might be one of the only people who would consider that a good idea. I would be happy if you were king of Australia, he told me once. As one does, I learned through the grapevine that he's begun calling our Lord's Supper Masquerade Mass. Less than 2 years now to retirement. And I finally find what I was looking for. It wasn't in Newman. I'm showing Kath a picture of the church in Sussex where I was ordained, and the book, Churches of Northwestern Southeast England, or something like that, falls open to a black and white picture of a plaque in an Anglican church in Maidstone that says, It was during the typhoid epidemic of 1896 that the daily offering of the Eucharist was begun in this parish. Well,
Thank you. That made me think, and I don't know if either Glenn or Josh wants to chime in on the relationship between art and symbols and the strange experience of watching among our friends and neighbors, and possibly in our own lives, the choice of the mask as something freighted with great symbolic importance, and arguably on both sides, although more visibly and obviously on those who refuse to wear one. And just to share, I mean, I never liked wearing a mask, but I didn't, not being able to go to the mass is a huge and non-symbolic tyranny for me. And I think objectively, being told I had to wear a mask to go to the mass would not strike me as a hill like the priest worth dying on. On the other hand, my aunt, who has no, well, she had religious convictions, essentially died because she refused to visit her doctor anymore in rural Massachusetts because he made you wear a mask in the office. And she died of an infection that would have been easily treatable if she had gone to the doctor. I don't think I have processed thoughts in this, but perhaps you do, Lucas, on this, and you raise it in your story on how something becomes a symbol and what does it mean to be a symbol.
yeah, well, I guess it is. It is a very powerful symbol of yeah, and some people, of course, um, um, excuse me, yeah, um, there were a lot of different ideas about this, and I tried to show some of them in the story, which ultimately comes to a sort of happy resolution actually at the end of the story, but which I didn't read, but. Yeah, I think it was an incredibly powerful symbol, and I think it comes down to what do you believe, you know, did you believe that it was necessary or helpful or not, or perhaps, you know, some people even believe that it was harmful to wear a mask.
But wait a minute, that's a little bit more on the question of whether it was a good idea. The
Right.
question I'm asking is, how does something become a symbol? So there are symbols that are corporately created over many time, a flag, you know, et cetera. And then we kind of watched in real time how
That becomes
something became freighted with symbolic significance. And I don't know if anyone has
Well,
any thoughts on
Yeah,
that
I
process.
would
maybe
just
Joshua, yeah.
Yeah, I would just say, you know, again, I'm just to happen to have Thomas Mann's Magic Mountain right here, and I think there's this powerful scene where a doctor comes into Hans Castorp's room, or he goes into the doctor's room rather, and it says, "Ah, yes, it's your turn now," he said, grabbing Hans Castorp's upper arm with one massive hand. He shoved him into place and gave him a sharp look, but he did not look directly at his face the way you look at another human being, but at his body. So one of the things that I would suggest is that the face only becomes symbolic when there's an aberration from the norm, or it becomes more symbolic when we see it because the way in which we're used to encountering it has been removed, right, and has been eclipsed and taken away. So that's one thing. I think that, you know, Flannery O'Connor says that the problem with symbols in literature is that sometimes it feels like you have to have kind of like understanding of a Freemasonic secret handshake in order to figure out the text, and you have to be this kind of super Gnostic kind of spy. But in fact, the best symbols are always operating on both a literal level and a metaphorical level simultaneously. And so in Lucas's story, for example, right? I mean, it's just, of course, it would be the case that a story set during that time in Australia is going to be caught up with whether someone's wearing a mask or not. In my Blue Walls Falling Down, you know, when Peter Clavier goes to Washington, D.C. to sort of try to redirect these activists, I mean, they're convinced that it's powerfully symbolic to assassinate this race-baiting senator. But he argues that it's more symbolic because death is so ubiquitous during COVID time, and mass shootings are so common, and death is just sort of something that we've almost lost our sense of the gravity of, that it's more symbolic if you blow up the Lincoln Memorial. And that would be even more symbolic because what is the sort of the norm? Again, the norm is that the statues in the South are being destroyed. All the Confederate statues are being torn down. But if you depart, again, to go back to where I started, like if you depart from the norm, then suddenly the nature of the thing is revealed in a different way that you were on an unexpected way.
You know, Maggie, the symbolism of the mask was, I think, felt by everyone, you know, sort of outside any kind of literary structure or anywhere else. I mean, if you were wearing the mask as you were supposed to, it symbolized a kind of compliant, good citizenship. If you didn't, you know, that would immediately mean that you had a kind of irresponsibility, not toward your own health, you know, which people didn't mind granting you, but toward the health of other people. It quickly became politicized, you know, so that being masked or not was a kind of sign that you could see, you know, evidently. People riding down the street in their cars by themselves with a mask on, you know, they're signaling something. It's a symbol. It's not a medical device, you know. And I think it quickly became, you know, that kind of potent image in our society rather than anything that had to do necessarily with medical protection.
Well, we're operating with a lot more certainty now than we had at the time.
Well, that agreed, but
And I would also say, I'm just like I think many people agree with you, and there's a strong political divide that maps on this. Again, just my reaction was if I see someone in their car so afraid they're wearing a mask, I feel bad for them, and I don't want to make their life worse by engaging in a symbolic struggle over whether or not they're weak or cowardly, excuse me, for wearing a mask, right? So obviously I didn't map onto the divide in that way. But I also think you're right, that there are reasons why that came to be experienced in that way.
it was probably different in Wyoming, you know, Erie, Wyoming, than it was elsewhere. So,
Well, the absurdities of shutting down the beaches during COVID. I mean, there was a lot of absurdities, but I don't want this to just devolve into a political discussion of COVID, because
Well,
there are probably many places where that can happen. But I'm wondering if anyone else in the audience has any reaction to these readings or would have a question for Glenn or Joshua or Lucas, wants to say something about the nature of symbolism. And probably I've distracted everyone into discussing their feelings on COVID. But if
Well,
we'd
while
like to
people are
do a
thinking,
literary reckoning, is there anyone
That's
who would
that's
like
probably
to?
my fault. That's my
Well,
fault.
while people are thinking
No,
about
I
that,
don't think so.
one little thing that I would just say that sort of, I think, again, makes this important distinction between sort of art that deals with political things because we're political animals, as Aristotle said, versus like politicized art that falls on partisan lines, and right, sort of like this is almost like a propaganda piece for the Republicans or the Democrats or something like that. I mean, any art that's worth its salt doesn't have a place
yes.
for kind of ideological lines being drawn. And I would use as an example of that actually Glenn's novel, right? Which actually, even just the scene that he read from, right? Here's Walter Giesack, the ultimate COVID skeptic. How does the scene end? Well, it ends with him getting the worst case of COVID that anyone has ever seen. So I have to just point out the comedy that's at work there. And that's what the novelistic treatment of a reality also brings to the table, is it makes us, I mean, you know, we don't laugh at the fact that he got COVID, but there is something kind of comedically relieving about the fact that this ultimate skeptic kind of got this kind of blow dealt with him that would have been the most humiliating and embarrassing thing, right? I think Kiernan
All
has,
right.
yeah.
Kiernan, do you want to say something?
I wanted to just ask Glenn, good to see you all, and Glenn, great to see you again.
Good to see
As
you.
you know,
Kevin.
I've read the first 2 installments, so I'm eagerly awaiting the third. And this one comes back or arrives in Wyoming, and I'm excited to see how you were able to sort of bring the books progressively to your adopted home state. And I wonder, because in the first 2 books, you know, you're dealing in the South primarily, and Georgia, which is a place you haven't lived in for a long time, and now you're writing in Wyoming, which is you've been living there for over a decade now. What was different and what was the same about that writing process?
Well, the emphasis on Sherman took me right back to Georgia, Kieran. This
By
time,
the way, you know, my dad loved studying Uncle Billy, and
you
so
know what,
I
Kieran?
can't wait to read that.
I'm sorry for this personal stuff, but Kieran's dad was a lawyer in New Haven, and he had when he came up to Thomas More, where he used to teach, he would open his wallet and show me the picture of General William Tecumseh Sherman that he carried around with him everywhere, knowing it would bait this, you know, Georgia and South Carolina native whose state was burned by the man. So anyway, it was yeah, it's interesting. That's a great question, and I think you know, it has to do in part with the whole process of kind of dealing with memory and dealing with place, you know, after a greater distance from it. And seriously, Sherman becomes a kind of symbolic figure, not just of what he stands for in terms of the Civil War and of Union, but of a particular kind of homecoming, maybe even a destructive homecoming, you know.
All right. Well, we promised that we'd get you out in 90 minutes. We have a lot of thank yous. Splendid work from all 3. Thank you so much for the reading. I wanted to say that our next Zoom event is on the Feast of the Assumption with Archbishop Cordileone, the painter James Langley, and the extraordinary art historian Elizabeth Lev, who will be coming to us from 2 a.m. in Rome. So let me post that. But I also wanted to mention, Joshua, that we've been partnering on a new idea. We've been doing retreats for artists and art lovers once a year. Had an incredible one this June at St. Patrick's Seminary, where we experienced a beautiful staged reading of Dana Joy's play, The Madness of Hercules, another Weisbrod book, and among other things. And I was so pleased. We've been doing evening events around the country in person. But then Weisbrod said, well, why don't we design evenings for artists and art lovers that you can do in your own home and share? Do you want to say a few words about that, Joshua?
Yeah, well, I think is Mary Finnegan still here? I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Mary, but if you feel up to giving a pitch, if you're still here, I'd love to hear your take on the art.
I'm still here.
Oh, good.
I'm here. So, well, I think, thanks so much for the reading tonight, all 3 of you. It was wonderful. And thank you, Maggie, for hosting. It was really fantastic to listen to everyone and to hear you discussing your novels. But our hope would be to both offer people opportunities to do these artist retreats on their own or with friends, but also to have evenings that are organized. You know, maybe somebody could host it in their home or at their parish hall, and come together and maybe do a reading. Like, say, Lucas, if he did one in Australia, he could read from his short story collection. He could read some Les Murray poems, and maybe have some shrimp on the barbie and some Australian beer. So fun, low-key nights, offering people a chance to come together and experience art as a living thing in their lives.
I think you know, it kind of grows out of Dana Gioia's kind of discovery when he was traveling around the country for 10 years and giving lectures on the Catholic Writer Today. And there was this kind of refrain in every city that he would speak in. The writers of faith, the Catholic writer, would come up to him and say, you know, I'm this kind of eccentric species. There's no one else like me. All of my friends who are faithful Catholics don't really understand or have time for art, and all of my artist friends don't have time for faith. And so one of the things that the MFA has revealed is that there are so many eccentric species of that individual case that there's almost like there's a plethora of people scattered across the country. They just don't know each other. So this is also a way of kind of advancing further that amazing cross-pollination that's been happening for the last 5 years.
So get on the Wise Blood Book newsletter if you want to hear more about this. Meanwhile, our next one will be September 6th in Centennial outside of Denver, where we'll do a staged reading of the play When Mother Teresa Met Malcolm Muggeridge. And if you'd like to do something like that with me, with us, with our marketing, etc., and you live in a major city, I'm going to put my email, because maybe you can be the center of building community in one way or another. And thank you for sharing your time, your comments, those of you who donated to help cover the costs of this event, which are primarily marketing costs, digital marketing costs. And I hope you get a chance to buy one or more of these novels and enjoy them. Thank you all. Until next time.
Thank you
God
very
bless.
much, Maggie.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
Maggie. Yeah, thank you, Josh. Thank you, Glenn.
Good
Pure
to see you
joy.
all.
Pure joy. Thank you.
Great to see you. Yeah.